Well, you kind of brought up another interesting point, and that is, so you're talking about this muscle disuse in response to basically maybe a surgery, perhaps illness, bed rest. I mean, this is like a prolonged type of immobilization, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference with respect to disuse atrophy when you're having a prolonged type of immobilization, like you've described? Maybe you have a cast or bed rest or surgery, illness, perhaps, but or just like reduced physical activity. I mean, there people go through these periods where life, workload, children, like things happen where your exercise routine, your physical activity goes down. And I mean, the pandemic would be obviously the biggest
Yeah.
example of that. Obviously, we're not in the pandemic anymore, but it's a good, I think, example of reduced physical activity. What's the difference between like the disuse atrophy, how it's affected basically between those types of immobilization periods?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we've recently just published a meta-analysis. Nick Preobrazhensky led that in. We looked at the decline in muscle mass and size in healthy people, and what Nick did is he looked at differentiate between 0 to 7 days, 7 to 14, and 14 onwards, and this is in generally healthy people. And what we found that there was a rapid decline after 7 days, a greater decline or a further decline from 7 to 14, then it tapered out. Now this is in healthy people. And then in people who are compromised or are actually going through surgery, these declines can even be greater. But what we do know is that the declines with complete inactivity or muscle disuse, they occur very, very rapidly. Within the first 7 days, you can see upwards of sometimes up towards a 7 to maybe even 10% loss in size and mass. But something that is not as often studied is, like you just said, those periods of inactivity in which you're not completely immobile, but you are reducing your, say, daily step count. And as you said, the pandemic is a great example of that. And we've done a couple of studies. I did the study as a postdoc with Tanner Stokes when we were in Stuart Phillips's lab, where we subjected older people to reduce daily step count. I believe it was below 1,000 steps per day, and that kind of mimicked what people would experience during, say, the pandemic, when they were being quarantined for 2 weeks, or influenza, or the step count typically experienced in hospital. And what we found was that there was a downregulation of protein synthesis, and this was in older pre-diabetic populations, and it wasn't fully recovered after 2 weeks to return to activity. So, we had a baseline period for around 5 days, and then it was a 2 week reduction to below 1,000 steps per day, and then back to normal recovery levels of step count, and the protein synthetic response hadn't managed to recover to its baseline. And we also noticed that indices of insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance had been compromised and weren't coming back. And this paper was published in 2017, so it was kind of prescient that we then have the pandemic come in which, rightly so, is we're being told you've got to quarantine for 2 weeks to mitigate the spread. But I think one thing that's being missed there is that there may well have been some negative effects that they might not be as great in magnitude as bed rest or complete immobilization, but they're certainly pernicious in nature in that they are imposing a negative, certainly metabolic effect and a downregulation of protein synthesis. Now, certainly they would recover if you extend the measurement out to 6 weeks, but if you go back to what I said at the start about that catabolic crisis model, maybe the decline in is not as great, but it's still another insult. It's still another contribution to that kind of downward staircase pattern. And then if you think, I moved to Canada 9 years ago, and the winters here are certainly not as warm, is not as mild as they are at home. And when you're in -20 and older people are a little bit scared to go outside, they don't go walking outside like they normally do. They stay inside in their home, so their step count is reduced then. So anyway, to cut a kind of long story short, there is they're negative. They're not as bad necessarily as complete disuse, but they may actually occur with more frequency than complete immobilization, which I think is an important point as well.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point there with the seasonal effect, because I think it's probably people are probably at least experiencing some to some degree of this disuse atrophy without even really realizing it, because
Yeah,
you think of muscle disuse atrophy, you think of it as being like severely immobilized. At least typically I think that's what most people are thinking about, where they're just in a cast or they're injured or bed rest, but they're not thinking of, oh, wintertime when I'm not going out and doing my outside activities as much. And that is actually a really good point, because I think it's common even in places that do have more mild winters. People get they basically just don't go outside even when it's, not quite as cold, but just a little bit colder. I know myself included. Fortunately, I have got indoor cycles and stuff that I like, think are just I think they're life changing and life saving, honestly. But you talked about this catabolic crisis, and it kind of leads into the disability threshold.
Yeah.
What is that, and how many periods of this inactivity or mobilization does it typically take for a person to get there?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to provide like a quantitative number on this of like newton meter strength or you know size of muscle or volume of muscle. I think it's a kind of a theoretical construct of we all know there's probably a threshold of muscle mass and strength that I would require to get out of this chair or to walk from here to the end of the road unassisted. And when I require assistance or somebody would require assistance, I would say that that is that threshold where you require help to get around. Now, you could start off with a fair bit of muscle, but over time, with those repeated insults, that is when, an inadequate recovery, um, the more that they occur in a space of time, the quicker the trajectory is going to be to breach that time at which you are not able to perform activities of daily living. Like I said, in younger folks, it's not too much of an issue, but you can imagine as you get older, we have sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and strength or function. And when you superimpose physical inactivity onto the biological decline in muscle mass and strength, sarcopenia, you can see how it can really accelerate, the negative effects of muscle loss and strength as we age. So I think putting a number on it would be very difficult. I think the message would be very much, try to stay as physically active as possible throughout life. And, you know, we we really can't avoid. Sometimes you go out, you play sport, you get injured. If somebody goes out and they walk, they slip, they fall, they may need a knee replacement. I think it's just about, preparing as best as you can for that insult. Like a surgery is essentially an insult to your body, So, it's a challenge and to prepare yourself for that, not just recovery, but also going into that situation to make sure you're in the best possible shape that you can be in to help you recover when you come out.